Hello everyone. Today I will be featuring the upcoming Tier 9 Battlecruiser Alaska. But before I start, let me begin by grabbing your attention. Right, I should be having your attention by now. The upcoming Tier 9 American, well, battlecruiser, not really cruiser. It does take up a cruiser slot though, because, well, there's no real battlecruiser slots in the game yet. The ship is one impressive beast. In this commentary, I will be extensively comparing it to the Kronshtadt, as it's the direct competition for the ship. Not to mention, I really tire of people constantly asking me if they should get the Alaska or the Kronshtadt. So in the future, I will just point at this vid and just go shoo, go watch it instead. Also important to notice that, of course, that the Kronshtadt and the Musashi will be removed from the store, or they can't be bought anymore after 0.8, which is in about 2 months from now. So if you do want to get the Kronshtadt instead, it might be just about, if you're a collector, it might be a valid option to get the Kronshtadt now and the Alaska later, simply if your goal is completion. Regardless though, the Alaska, the health pool on the ship is insane. When you consider that, once again, you should be comparing it to the other Tier 9 cruisers. It sits at 60.8k health, and with that it has more than 20% more health than its closest competition, which is the Ruin. The Kronshtadt is, of course, a similar odd ship, more of a battlecruiser once again, and it sits at an even crazier 71k health, so it has a significant advantage over the Alaska. Now, you'd expect such a huge health pool advantage to come with some significant disadvantages, but honestly, they aren't really that bad. The concealment on the ship sits at 11.9 kilometers, that's with the full stealth build, slightly better than Kronstadt's 12.4 with the similar build. What is kind of crazy though is that it actually beats the Donskoy, that has 12.3 kilometers of concealment with the full stealth build. So, the speed, standard American 33 knots, 34.6 if you run the speed flag, so it's just as fast as the Buffalo and the Seattle. Hell, it's actually even faster than the Ruin that's still stuck at 32.5 knots. Even the rest of the handling isn't really that bad. A stock 13-second rudder shift, which can be improved to 10.4 if you run the module. Considering the likes of Buffalo sit at 9.1 seconds and Ruin sits at 9 seconds, 10.4 isn't really the end of the world. The turning circle is 850 meters, which is actually slightly worse than Kronstadt's 840. But then in return, the Kronshtadt has slightly worse rudder shift. Ultimately though, the differences there are so small you're really unlikely to notice them. In comparison, the Buffalo, which is the Tech 3 equivalent of the American heavy cruiser, has an 800 meter turning circle. In fact, if you look at it a bit more, if you compare it a bit more to the Buffalo in terms of handling, you are giving up 1.4 seconds of rudder shift and 50 meters of turning circle for 13,000 health, 60.8 instead of 47.8. So, and then you add in the fact that the Alaska has significantly better armor and a much lower citadel, and the trade-off is pretty blatantly in favor of the new premium if we're talking direct combat. You do have to remember though that the Buffalo does have a 1.4 km concealment advantage thanks to having 10.5 km concealment with the full build, which will once again tip it a bit in its favor. In direct combat though, Alaska has some huge number advantages there. Speaking of the armor, this new version of Alaska has had the Citadel raised almost to the waterline. I guess Wargaming didn't enjoy my demonstration of how to beat battleships 1 versus 1. For those that didn't see the demonstration, I literally parked my Alaska full broadside in front of them, and then I just out-traded them in raw damage, and they couldn't Citadel me because the Citadel was so deeply underwater. This change though, this updated, slightly nerfed Alaska, has made it possible to Citadel the ship. It's not that easy because it's still a very low Citadel, but it does absolutely happen now. The armor itself consists of multiple different platings. The bow and the stern is 27 millimeters, which means it'll bounce 380 millimeter guns, but anything bigger will be going through it like it's, well, wet tissue paper, basically. The upper belt is 28 millimeters, meaning 1 millimeter thicker, which actually has no real advantage over the 27 millimeter armor, as the same 406 millimeter guns and higher will punch straight through it as well. The central deck armor surrounding the superstructure is, however, 36 millimeter plating, which will bounce up to 500 plus millimeter AP, meaning you can even bounce Yamato shells as long as they land on the central part of the ship, and obviously without enough plunging fire so that they're actually bouncing and not penetrating. In reality though, an overmatchable upper belt and an overmatchable bow and stern means that close range, any sort of angle tanking is pretty damn rough, because the BBs will just punch, well, straight through your entire health pool, basically. You might have a lot of health, but you're also a very big ship. And for anyone who's played World of Warships, being a very big ship is certainly not an advantage in this game. I can briefly touch on the AA, because it kind of correlates to this whole size thing. The AA on the ship is solid, very similar to what you might find on the Buffalo. The major difference is, however, that because you don't have cruiser dispersion on the Alaska, you slot the improved main gun dispersion module in the third slot instead of the increased AA range. So you will always be 20% range behind the cruiser competition. You could replace it with the AA module, but unless you're actively queuing with a carrier teammate, I cannot recommend it, as the improved gun dispersion is always valuable, whereas of course the improved AA range is quite situational. A significant problem the ship does suffer from is vulnerability to AP bombers, even worse than the Des Moines, since not only is your AA weaker, you're also clumsier, and as I mentioned, you're also very, very big, which means you're a much bigger target to hit. Any half-decent carrier can bait out your defensive AA with torp bombers or with just one AP bomb squad, forcing you to use it, and then once it's on cooldown they follow up with the second AP bomber or both of them in case you used it on torpedo squads. So, and this will deal massive citadel damage. I played an ocean game in the Alaska where the enemy midway dealt 60,000 damage to me just with the AP bombs alone. So, very significant weakness to keep in mind. Let's move on though. The one thing that many are probably most interested in, and that is the guns. The bread and butter of why this ship is called a battlecruiser, the main gun power. The Alaska wields 9 305mm guns split into 3 turrets, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. Pretty standard American cruiser design right there. On paper, these guns actually seem worse than Kronштadt's. They have a longer reload, 1.3 seconds longer if you run the reload module and the build on both of them. And the AP shell velocity is actually only 762 meters per second, which it sounds pretty pitiful when you compare it to Kronstadt's amazing 900 meter per second AP shell velocity. Now, this obviously leads to a multitude of things, including, well, it's much harder to land the AP volleys at long range. Alaska long range volleys can be very tricky to land, but on the other hand, as you might see, dispersion. I will get into that a bit more in just a bit, but the shells are very much, if you played, well, Des Moines, or if you played North Carolina, it continues the American trend of very slow moving AP shells, but improved dispersion instead. Another thing that is obviously affected by this though is raw penetration. Kronstadt's 900 meter per second means that the AP shells are extremely punchy, but it also means that because the shells have a flatter trajectory thanks to their faster initial shell velocity, the Kronshtadt is also less affected by the angling of the armor as the shell plunges down on the broadside of the ships. In raw value, the Alaska can punch through 449mm armor at 10 kilometers, which, if we look at this Montana that's slowly crawling around this corner here, should be enough to citadel him. But well, I will demonstrate. I was actually interested because I long suspected that because of the plunging aspect and so forth, and any sort of slight angling would really skew with the actual penetration values. And as you can see here, shooting his belt, we get shatters. Not bounces because they're angled, but just straight up shatters. Not enough penetration to punch through. I experimented by trying to shoot the nose, seeing if I could maybe get some raw pens on the nose instead. So, but overall it seems quite pitiful, so in the end I decided to go for the safe approach, which is shooting the upper belt and the superstructure with the AP for that consistent safe damage. You see I'm aiming a bit higher to make sure the shells, I'm not going for the citadel anymore, I'm going for that upper belt for that classic raw penetration damage. In this very same situation, of course, Kronshtadt would have had absolutely no issues. In fact, we can put a short demonstration in between here. I shot the Montana in my Alaska from 8.7 kilometers. In comparison, here I'm shooting a Montana in a Kronshtadt from 9 kilometers. And the obvious difference in penetration capacity should be, well, quite apparent to everyone. It doesn't even matter if I switch to a Montana even further away, well, couple of kilometers further away, the results are still the same. In fact, Kronstadt's penetration is so absurdly insane that I can even target the Montana almost at max range and I will still be able to citadel him. I can put up a small chart that shows you the difference in penetration for these different tier 9 cruisers, and you can see just who's leading the pack and what kind of difference the Kronshtadt is leading the pack with. The flatter trajectory of the Kronshtadt, of course, applies to this quite heavily as well, and I honestly suffered a fair bit in the Alaska trying to use AP. I tried to use AP as much as I did in the Kronshtadt, which didn't really work out. It encourages switching to HE a lot, even against full broadside battleships if they're at very, very long range, because it just seems to be more consistent. Sometimes close range shells, well, you saw it, it leads to shatters, so often it's almost safer to go for the upper belt penetrations, unless you're practically completely point blank, in which case, well, I'd say 5 kilometers, 5-6 kilometers, then you can go for the somewhat consistent citadels. But at 8.7, the Montana belt just shattered my AP without any issues. Now, I didn't say that this doesn't tell the whole story, and that's because Alaska dispersion is significantly better, which obviously means the AP is a lot more consistent. And to add to that fact, it has the improved American AP angles, which means in angles like the Kronshtadt would be bouncing, the Kronshtadt AP would be bouncing, you have no issues getting penetrations. This makes the ships absolutely devastating against enemy cruisers, as you might be seeing here right now. This is the very definition of a cruiser killer. I've comfortably charged into these situations where I'm basically alone against multiple enemy cruisers, and all it takes is basically one mistake from them and the hard-hitting AP just ends the fight, because you have such an easy time. The penetration is more than enough to get those citadels even on very, very angled targets, and you do get the penetration thanks to the improved AP angle. So there's a lot of fantastic synergy going on here when it comes to fighting cruisers. Like, you are a fantastic cruiser killer. On the other hand though, you are quite squishy to the HE spam. Well, you're quite squishy to a lot of the spam. In fact, here I'm closing the distance as we're trying to turn this game around. Okay, you might have noticed the Grozovoi was complaining in chat. For those that missed it, the Grozovoi in game thought that the best idea he could do was to charge. When we had 2 camps, he decided to charge through B into A. And at A there were 4 radar cruisers. And then he got killed, and then he of course blamed the team, because naturally it was the team's fault that he chose to run into 4 radar cruisers. Regardless though, I've quite enjoyed the Alaska. It felt a bit weird getting used to it because, well, you easily play it very much like you would play the Kronshtadt, and you kinda can't do that. It's more, if I had to put the comparison up, I'd say that the Alaska is more of a cruiser than the Kronshtadt is. Whereas Kronshtadt heavily leans into the whole battleship approach of playing it, with using massive amounts of AP and just this shooting AP at everything. you kind of cycle it a lot then. The Kronshtadt loves just lapping down battleships and such, whereas in the Alaska it's more careful play. You have to use your concealment advantage that you have to your advantage because, well, your health advantage can evaporate quite quickly because thin armor plus large size isn't exactly a fun combination. Ultimately though, I think the Alaska is very strong. I think it's a very good ship, and honestly, I actively compete against tier 10 cruisers in this thing, so I would say compared to the tier 9 cruiser competition, it's quite obviously more powerful than them. I'd like to avoid using the word overpowered, but I mean, it is so much more powerful than pretty much all the tier 9 cruisers that you end up facing. You end up by habit comparing it to the tier 10s simply because of its raw power. So would I recommend the Alaska? I mean, absolutely. It's a good ship, no doubt about that. It's a good ship. It's not the easiest ship to play though. It was significantly easier before they raised the Citadel because then you could make a bunch of boneheaded mistakes and kind of get away with it. But now it has that vulnerable Citadel combined with vulnerable armor, and it's still even though I mentioned that it has a lot of health, it's ultimately still armored like a cruiser, and it's got 11.9 km concealment. So a lot of battleships will be taking a lot of potshots at this thing because they know, just like with the Des Moines, they can get a lot of juicy pens. The 36mm deck armor does alleviate this a bit, but you are still quite the juicy target. The torpedo belt isn't too special either. I'm eating it on the nose though. At this point I'm kind of just buying time. Radaring the Des Moines while pushing up to make sure that my Minotaur from B can just farm him. If he tries to push up and kill me, well, my Minotaur will kill him for me, which is exactly what appears to be happening. And with the power of radar, I'm of course pushing into the cap. Worth mentioning that the radar is less powerful than Kronstadt's, considering you're limited to American ranges, whereas Kronstadt radar of course is 11.7. So even though Kronstadt has worse concealment, you actually have an easier time putting the Kronstadt radar into usable conditions compared to Alaska, where unless there's an island you can hide behind, getting value out of the radar is very, very difficult. Which isn't really that bad of a thing. This game doesn't exactly crave additional radar cruisers at this point. Anyway, let me show you guys my recommended build for the ship as of right now. Right, starting off, we of course have the modules. Well, consumables. Priority number 1 should be the damage con, followed by the improved heal and radar and defensive AA in that order. There's a lot of consumables you can run, but honestly radar and defensive AA is kind of the bread and butter of any American build. Upgrade wise, turret survival, improved radar duration. If you can't afford an improved radar duration, I'd probably just go for the raw tankiness. I don't think I've lost engine or rudder in this thing once, so just the raw tankiness might be the best option if you don't have a surveillance radar available. And finally, this is something that I highlighted, the improved dispersion. Once again, you don't have that cruiser dispersion, and your guns are your bread and butter, so this thing actually benefits you a fair bit. Usually on cruisers you go for AA guns because the percentage bonus is so small, but considering your wonky dispersion, this one does help a fair bit. So I do recommend aiming systems mod 1, and I am running the additional tankiness because as you're a battlecruiser, fire duration is longer than for normal cruisers. I'm not entirely sold if this is the best option. The possibility of running steering gears and cutting your rudder shift to what, 10.4 was it, is also absolutely viable. I think this one will come down to playstyle, which one you prefer. Both are quite good. Acceleration mod is quite questionable on the Alaska, I think. Maybe you'll get value out of it. Questionable. Concealment. I mean, ultimately you're still a cruiser. Yes, absolutely. And faster reload. Worth mentioning is that the Alaska actually has a 19-kilometer range compared to Kronstadt's 18.2, so going for the reload is a much more straightforward choice than it might be for the Kronshtadt, where some people might consider going for the range to help alleviate that issue. But honestly, 18 kilometers is more than enough in my opinion. I think both are just fine. Captain perks wise, I'm actually using my John Doe Des Moines Captain, and this is because this improved expert loader has such fantastic synergy with the Alaska, as it allows, as I mentioned, you're forced to switch between HE and AP a lot on the ship, and getting that minus 75% cooldown means you can switch ammo type in 3 to 4 seconds on the Alaska, which is amazing because, well, the AP is so punishing. Being able to switch to it at the moment's notice and punish a cruiser can lead to a devastating strike. That's how powerful it is. Ultimately though, you go for priority target, adrenaline rush, superintendent and concealment expert, and then I go for AFT, and this is because this is my Des Moines Captain. Would I still go for it on the Alaska? Probably, because it does. You do have decent AA, and buffing it to 6 kilometers isn't bad. It also means you can shoot down spotter and fighter planes that are keeping you spotted. Your plane spotting range is a pretty massive 9.6, so ultimately running or not running AFT doesn't really affect that spotting range in case they are outside of it. Mostly it is just to help you against carriers. If they do show up, that AP bomb vulnerability is very much a real thing. The option of running fire prevention, going for the tanky battlecruiser build, also exists, but once again, your armor is so squishy. If you're in a situation where people can farm you, you're already not in the best position to begin with. I'd probably go with the standard Des Moines build, which is AFT. After this point, I do run the turret traverse. It does benefit the ship a fair amount, because the default turret traverse is somewhat sluggish, especially when you run the reload module. Mostly I run it because it's a John Doe Captain, so I get the special bonus. For the same reason. Expert loader, I would probably run it even without the bonus though. That's absolutely a recommended perk, even if you don't have a special captain to use for this. And finally, we have Jack of all trades, which when you have so many consumables, especially radar cooldown and such, it's very useful. There could be some trade-offs. Absolutely, you might be easily able to fit in fire prevention into this build if you should so choose. Not something I would particularly care for on the Des Moines, but on the Alaska, since it's so much bigger and bulkier and needs so much more fire damage, switching the fire prevention in for one of these optional skills is absolutely a possibility. This is the build I've been running though, my Des Moines Captain, and I've been enjoying it quite a bit. This is very, of course, random battle build, but if it's Alaska, there's no competitive, you can use it in any way. Flag-wise, healing flag, absolutely. Fire duration reduction, absolutely. And I would probably recommend November Foxtrot as well. Those are the bread and butter flags. Then you can mix in things like AA and speed, should you so choose. But ultimately the rest can just be credits and income. And the income is, of course, very, very good. I've had multiple games, 1.5 million credit games, because, well, it's a tier 9 premium. A lot of money income should be expected. Anyway, that was my Alaska preview review. I don't know. I'll call it a preview for now, but considering they're only making small changes, like the latest change was just slightly lifting the Citadel up to the waterline. Like, well, it's still slightly below the waterline, but the latest change was just lifting it slightly. If they're only doing such minimal changes, it means they're probably quite satisfied with how the Alaska is performing, which means that it's probably quite close to being released. And in that case, this is not a preview, this is in fact a review, a commentary, whatever. But if it's still a work in progress, then this was totally a sneak peek and nothing final at all. I will talk to you guys later. I hope you guys enjoyed it.